Just wanted to say a few words of welcome to all of you here. Some very familiar faces and some new ones. Always very welcome to the house too. My name's Celine Luper MacDade and I'm the director and curator here at Dr. Johnson's House Museum. And it's a real thrill to be celebrating our second of an annual series of monthly lunchtime lectures sponsored by the Fleet Street Quarter Business Improvement Development, which is wonderful sponsors of this programme. So without further ado, we're here in the month of May. It seems quite a long time ago now, but it is the month in which we coronated a new king, King Charles III. And we've themed the lecture this time around the sense of monarchy, of royalty, and of the pomp and ceremony, and of visits. Johnson himself was quite delighted at the coronation of King George III because he was known to be quite an erudite man, not necessarily the leading intelligence of the era perhaps, but certainly one who was keen to support patronage of both sciences and arts, and he was certainly known as a great collector as well. Johnson got access to his Buckingham House, later Buckingham Palace library, which was vast, and was grateful to do a great deal of research in the library there. And he was once blessed by a surprise visit from King George III as well, and was delighted by it. They spent many hours in conversation, and it's a story that Johnson would regale many of his friends with many years later as well. It made a huge impression on him. And it really is today that we're going to be looking at in further detail with Paige Emrick, our speaker, at the sense of royal visits and what they mean. So looking at the relationship between town and crown that these visits engendered. Paige herself is studying a PhD at Leicester University. She's looking into the sense of royal visitors and royal patronage. You can explain much better yourself, and what this meant. So has spent a lot of time in regional archives, in national archives, so I'm sure has got a wealth of knowledge to share with us today. Please welcome Paige with me. Thank you for joining us today.
So yeah, thank you, Celine, for the really warm welcome. And as I say, I'm at University of Leicester at the minute, so I just handed in my PhD a couple of months ago. Hopefully by next month I might actually be a doctor. So my PhD thesis has looked at the royal visits of George III and George IV, so late 18th, 19th century, looking at the practicalities, about how you stage a royal visit, sort of the logistic routes, and then particularly focusing on the people who on the receiving end of royal visits, so whether that's individuals, the town, how they felt about having a royal visit, the preparation that went involved, sort of the collecting and souvenir culture and any lasting legacy that those royal visits had. So today I'm going to talk to you quite briefly about sort of the difference between George III and George IV, father and son, and how their royal visits sort of set the trend for what was going to come for many later years and things that we might recognise today. I skipped ahead a little bit. Oh, there. So, there we go. Here's George III, George IV. So, for as long as the monarchy has existed, it has been necessary for the monarch to travel. For medieval kings and queens, the need to progress the length and breadth of the country was a prerequisite to gaining and maintaining their throne. When the Tudors came to power, they transformed royal travel into sweeping, elaborate displays designed to emphasise the monarchy's political power and eminent position at the top of society. The 17th century saw the Stuarts largely continue and expand upon much of the ceremony and pageantry that the Tudors had established. Up until here, conducting a royal progress was nearly an annual occurrence, often linked to escaping plague-ridden London. So, with the Hanoverian accession in 1714, such visits largely fell out of favour. Rather than travelling around their newly inherited kingdom in an attempt to assimilate themselves into British culture and to get to know their new subjects, both George I and George II much preferred to frequently travel back to their native Hanover. So after an absence of royal travel for nearly half a century, with his accession in 1760, George III therefore had the opportunity to re-establish and remodel the format and protocol of royal visits for a new generation of royalty, courtiers and society. Admittedly, it would be some years into his reign before he would start this process, as he was somewhat preoccupied in the early years with raising an ever-growing family with his new bride, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Political crises at home and abroad, not least ministerial instability and a stumbling economy, the American Revolutionary War, and the fallout from the French Revolution similarly demanded his attention. But after a slow start, George III started to embrace travel from the late 1770s, undertaking it with greater frequency in the following decades. But George III has long suffered with the association with two episodes in his reign that have dominated above all others. To modern audiences, George has simply been categorised as the Mad King due to his several bouts of mental illness throughout his reign, or else as the king who lost America. To American audiences, he has gone down in history as a tyrant who blocked the way to independence. Such tropes have been all the harder to dismantle within the broader public consciousness due to recent retellings of historical events and George's life through popular culture mediums of theatre and film. Entertaining though they may be, Alan Bennett's The Madness of King George III and Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton only add to the often repeated clichés about George III. Confirming the axiom that every Hanoverian king disliked his son, George III and George IV endured a strained relationship, and consequently George IV actively strove to be different from his father in nearly every way. With his long tenure as Prince of Wales, George IV spent his time in search for pleasure and entertainment amongst his friends and mistresses at the theatre and racecourses, fighting for a military role and trying to gain monarchical powers during the Regency crises. Due to these personal traits and behaviours, George IV has also not gone down well in the public consciousness by being repeatedly characterised as a playboy king-in-waiting and inept monarch. Within popular culture, he has been lampooned as the dim-witted fop in Blackadder III, or merely reduced to the fat one in Horrible History's retelling of the Hanoverians. George IV's cultural and artistic patronage, however, was one of the redeeming features of his personality and reign, and has consequently attracted considerable attention. Moreover, George IV's royal tours would also shape how contemporary audiences understood him. He would go on to expand upon his father's visits by travelling more frequently across greater distances, as well as later introducing the state visit. In doing so, he added his own personal touches to the way in which these occasions were conducted, and which heavily contrasted to George III's style. So this paper will firstly outline the geographical range of both George III and George IV's royal visits, highlighting some of the key places that they stayed, before going on to explain how these visits helped to shape the public perception of the two kings' different personalities. For George III, travelling with his wife and children and staying in more private accommodation would signal his domesticity and family values. For George IV, on the other hand, his pursuit of entertainment and desire to socialise with the aristocracy would mark him as a pleasure-seeking prince. Keeps jumping ahead. There we go. So on here we've got places that George III stayed in red, and you'll see them mostly around the south. So he stays in cities that are used to sort of ancient loyal cities, those used to having a royal visit in years gone by, Exeter, Plymouth, Winchester, but also a few new places, so Cheltenham and Weymouth notably. And George IV is also visiting a few of those places father does, but gets a lot further north on his progresses. That's sort of to illustrate for a bit. So, deciding where to visit was the first step in planning any royal trip, but the geographical range of George III's and George IV's travels varied considerably. Despite a long-lasting fascination with British geography and topography that is evident from his extensive map and print collection, nowadays held in the British Library, the scope of George III's travel was limited. Military and naval obligations during the first 20 years of his reign kept George III predominantly rooted in the home counties and along the south coast, with two notable naval reviews at Portsmouth Dockyard in 1773 and 1778. A smattering of social cause led to a 5-day progress to Winchester and Salisbury in September 1778, and 2 trips to Oxford in 1785 and 86 to visit Blenheim Palace, Newnham House and tour the university. George III's rare public appearances in his early reign caused concern for Hans Stanley, Governor of the Isle of Wight and MP for Southampton, who remarked that, "As he has lived so much in retirement, I thought he would have been embarrassed and reserved in so large a company." From the late 1780s, however, George III's quest for better health saw him travel to the West Country, with a notable visit to Cheltenham, Worcester and Gloucester in 1788 to drink the spa waters. From 1789, Weymouth would become the King's preferred holiday destination, setting up a home away from home at Gloucester Lodge on the seafront, providing him with a prime location to sea bathe and stroll along the esplanade. George's affection for Weymouth is evident in his choice to visit the town a total of 14 times in 16 years, and it was through the uptake of travel that George was able to transform these views of his reticent personality by being seen mingling with the public in the town, along the beach and at the theatre, allowing the newspapers to easily comment on the king's behaviour and assign him a new domestic and supposedly private persona. In contrast, with less royal responsibility, as Prince of Wales, George IV had more time for leisure pursuits and to travel greater distances across the country. George IV's determination to seek alternative locations to his father saw him drink the spa waters in Bath and build his lavish pavilion in Brighton as his preferred seaside escape. Outside the need to travel for his health, George IV's tours of England would cover large swathes of the Midlands and the North. And once king, he would extend his travel outside of England with historic visits to Ireland, Hanover and Scotland. Once the purpose and location of the visit was settled upon, the next challenge was to arrange how to get there. It might be expected that the transport would be overseen by the royal household, who had traditionally been responsible for planning royal visits. Memoranda in George III's handwriting, however, suggest that this was something he personally oversaw. A combination of his love of horses and riding, his intimate knowledge of his household staff, his fascination with travel, and his micromanaging inclinations meant that he wished to be directly involved with the preparation for his trips. Notes for some of his earlier visits to Portsmouth in 1773 and Cheltenham in 1788, shown here, show George working out the dates for and the route for the journey, the distance between milestone markers, how long each leg would take to travel, and which servants and horses to send out ahead of his departure from Windsor. An equally detailed account of horses, carriages and servants required for the 1778 trip to Portsmouth also exists within the King's correspondence in the Royal Archives, in an unidentified handwriting, but further suggests that George was signing off these procedures before the visit could go ahead. Whether these examples were exceptions due to a level of personal excitement at some of his early naval reviews and one of his first private visits, or whether George III prepared similar calculations for each of his visits is unclear, as other examples do not survive. The fragmentary quality of the notes suggests it is likely such memos would have usually been destroyed after use, and therefore, coupled with his penchant for planning, it is perhaps not inconceivable that this was a regular activity for the king, and one in which he presumably found satisfaction or tranquillity. In contrast to George III's management style regarding his travel, George IV seems to have enjoyed the destination rather than the journey, with archival sources suggesting it was more senior members of the royal household left to arrange the entire practicalities of the royal visit rather than himself. So once the planning of the journey was arranged, choosing where to stay in the location held a great social and political significance. Visiting courtiers' country houses remained an important part of any trip's itinerary, and one that George III and Queen Charlotte continued to enjoy and uphold. However, with his general shift to more domestic and private style of visit, George III shortened the length of time that the royal party stayed in these country houses. Rather than staying for an extended period of several days or even weeks, as was customary in the Tudor or Stuart progresses, the royal family tended to pay a day visit to their aristocratic friends, to tour their estate and have dinner, and then return to their own lodgings within the neighbourhood. On the few occasions where George III and his family took an extended trip to a country house, it was because the house was already vacated to allow for relative privacy. For example, the Earl Falconberg offered his empty lodge in Cheltenham for the King's recovery in the summer of 1788. And in the following year, the royal party resided at Saltram House in Plymouth for nearly a fortnight, as its owner Lord Boringdon had died the previous year. If an overnight visit was required, they would normally only stay for 1 or 2 nights to break up the journey to the next location, as was the case with Longleat House and Tottenham Park in Wiltshire on the return journey to Windsor in 1789. These shorter visits to country houses meant that George III and Charlotte could still fulfil the ideal of a polite couple and indulge in their personal interests in the arts and sciences by viewing other people's collections, but without burdening their hosts economically or socially for a prolonged period. George III's desire for practicality above anything else when travelling was noted by court contemporaries, including Fanny Burney, Keeper of the Robes at court. When travelling to Cheltenham in 1788, Burney remarked in her diary on the modest size of her rooms and noted only the most important members of the entourage could be housed with the royal family at Falconberg Lodge. On this occasion, the royal family was attempting to travel with as small a suite as possible for convenience and enhanced privacy, especially given the delicate nature of the king's health at the time. This reduced mode of travel projected a notion of an ordinary family travelling for rest and relaxation and to enjoy each other's company. Although this image was widely greeted with approval by members of the public in the localities, evident in the huge crowds lining the route and the erection of triumphal arches along the roadsides, seemingly some members of the court were yet to fully accept this pared-back style of visit. Again, in the following year, on the inaugural trip to Weymouth, Burney was quick to criticise her cramped living quarters. "My bedroom is in the attics. The house will only hold the females of the party. The 2 adjoining houses are added for the gentlemen and the pages and some of the other suite, cooks, etc., but the footmen are obliged to lodge still further off." The houses in question were obviously not designed to accommodate an extensive household, but nonetheless, George III made his choices based upon location and accessibility to the amenities he needed, such as the sea and the esplanade, rather than the suitability for his courtiers. The constraints on the household continued during the royal family's annual visits to Weymouth, where in 1794, George III was similarly concerned with the accommodation details, as he noted the number of rooms required for him, Queen Charlotte and his daughters. George appeared not only to limit the number of bedrooms to be used, but also to curb the number of servants to be taken down to the coasts with them, requiring his 4 daughters to share between them 2 rooms and 2 servants. Such choices contributed to the image of the royal household, and with it George III's kingship, as one of necessity and frugality rather than splendour and excess. George III's preference for travelling in a small family unit in pursuit of privacy was further discernible through his unwillingness to entertain large parties or maintain regular court routines when away, such as levées and drawing rooms. This uncertainty over how to prepare the accommodation according to the king's wishes was also evident in the correspondence of the servants of the houses that George rented. During the unexpectedly prolonged stay at Saltram House in Plymouth in 1789, John Lee, a gentleman of Exeter and friend of the Parker family of Saltram, issued several letters in quick succession to Frederick Fritz Robinson, the brother-in-law of the recently deceased Lord Boringdon, to secure the most accurate advice for preparing Saltram ahead of the royal family's arrival. These letters highlight how quickly the plans for the route and scheduled events shifted even after the royal party had set off, but they also underlined George's desire for privacy and domesticity. The wine order had to be cancelled as there was no occasion for entertaining. Merely a daily bottle of port was required for the king. And likewise, the venison order was reduced, with guidance being sought for what should be done with the remainders. No public levee was to be held, and regardless of their rank, those persons who were requested to meet the king at Saltram were rejected, except for the lucky few permitted to talk to him on the steps or before the house. After complying with the public events in Exeter, with tours of the cathedral and loyal addresses from the corporation, George III was seeking a heightened level of privacy. The extension of what was supposed to be a few nights' stay at Saltram into a nearly fortnight retreat demonstrates that when George III found the means of securing solitude away from his kingly duties, he clung to it. George was attempting the near impossible task of separating the official and private roles of kingship on his travels, but as an accidental consequence, his retreat into privacy advocated domesticity as his signature style of kingship to a wider provincial audience. So in reaction against his parents' example of frugality when travelling, George IV preferred to lodge in much grander comfort than small empty townhouses, and sought the companionship and entertainment wherever he went. George IV's prolonged status as prince, rather than reigning monarch, meant that he had more time available to travel and could move more easily further away from the seat of power in Windsor and London, as he was not required to be constantly on hand for parliamentary issues. Improvements in transport infrastructure, such as smoother travel due to turnpike roads, decreased journey times and better vehicles and horses, also meant that George IV could afford to travel merely for the enjoyment of it. In contrast to his father's more private style of travel, George IV was, in effect, reverting back to a more typical Tudor or Stuart style of progress by slowly touring his way through the counties on a strategic route to reside at his aristocratic friends' houses. Invitations to parties gave George IV a purpose to travel. Despite her fear that such an invitation might be improper, Mary Isabella, the Dowager Duchess of Rutland, invited George IV to her son's 21st birthday party on the 4th of January 1799 at Belvoir Castle near Grantham. In order to help him make up his mind regarding whether to accept the invitation, the Dowager Duchess sent a list of persons expected to attend, advised him to arrive a day or two in advance due to the bad weather and poor quality of roads around the castle, and warned him of the need to dine at 5 o'clock due to the early winter's night. The physical condition of the castle was such a concern to both the Dowager Duchess and her son that they both felt the need to separately inform George of the dreadful dilapidated state of the old castle and the apartments and the rotting state of this old pile, in the hope it would not prevent him from coming. Although by the late 18th century the nobility might have become uncertain regarding the correct protocol for inviting royalty to their homes, they nevertheless were acutely aware of the need to provide an impressive setting to entertain the heir to the throne. His fondness for the young Duke and his friendship with the Rutland family, plus the excuse for a grand party, was enough of a magnet for George to accept the invitation and make a special trip to the Midlands in the middle of winter. George was also able to use the party as a pretext for calling in to see another friend in the neighbourhood, the Earl of Moira at Donington Hall in Leicestershire. By widening the geographical scope of his tours, George could ensure he saw as many friends as possible within one trip, and thereby extended his pursuit of leisure and social activities. Some members of the aristocracy easily secured royal visits to their homes through being suitably located along the road network or due to an already formed mutual friendship. Others, meanwhile, had to try harder to attract royalty in the hope that securing a visit would elevate their own status at court, or that they could use the occurrence as one-upmanship within elite circles. One of the most persistent petitioners was George Coventry, the 6th Earl of Coventry of Croom Court in Worcestershire. The Earl of Coventry had already had the honour of hosting George III, Queen Charlotte and their 3 eldest princesses at Croom in 1788, when they called in to visit him, dining lavishly on salmon, lamprey, venison and carp, and enjoying a tour of the house and estate. The visit on this occasion was merely a passing call as part of the royal party's extended trip to Cheltenham and the surrounding towns. Despite hosting the King in 1788, the Earl of Coventry was not content with a single royal visit and continued to chase the Prince of Wales to pay him a visit too. A letter sent to the Earl of Coventry by the Prince of Wales Equerry, Sir Benjamin Bloomfield, on the 6th of July 1800, stated that George would have very great pleasure in making a visit at Croom, should his tour take that direction. George's habit of conducting wider tours of the Midlands and the north of England and residing at local country houses for convenient accommodation was already well established by the turn of the century. As a previous Lord of the Bedchamber to George III, the Earl of Coventry was clearly favoured by the monarch and was hoping to also obtain the favour of the Prince of Wales to extend his royal privilege to the next generation. Letters like this highlight how individuals attempted to influence the planning of royal tours in the hope that their houses would be included in the itinerary, and with it the chance to curry favour to royalty in private. Perhaps in his insistence to be opposite of his father, both politically and monarchically, and not wanting to inherit any of George III's court favourites, the Prince of Wales did not take up the invitation to visit Croom and bestow an additional prestige upon the Earl of Coventry on this occasion. Refusing to be downhearted, however, with the rejection in 1800, the Earls of Coventry would prove persistent in their quest for a second royal visit. In 1815, another invitation was extended to George IV, now Prince Regent, to visit Croom as part of his tour by the new generation, George VII Earl of Coventry. Again, Bloomfield, on behalf of his master, had to decline due to having already made arrangements to visit the Marquess of Winchester. Again, the following year, in 1816, the new Earl of Coventry invited the Prince Regent to stop at Croom on his tour, and again George, while professing himself flattered at the offer, had to decline due to fear that upon his approaching tour, the direction of this time would not allow him to do so this season. These repeated invitations extended by the Earl of Coventry provide a clear indication that the increased status attached to hosting royalty, which the Earl continually desperately chased. George IV's personal approach, as well as his well-known penchant for parties and socialising amongst court circles, meant that the aristocracy felt they could petition him directly to offer up their homes. If successful, the host in question would be able to secure royal favour and in turn would open opportunities for increased social status and patronage, both in political and court circles. By targeting George IV when still prince with these invitations, it was hoped this would build up an enduring relationship that would prove useful in later years when he finally succeeded as king. George IV's preferences for staying with the nobility when touring allowed him the valuable opportunity to develop his court circle and effectively establish an opposition court to his father, something that was particularly pertinent with the Regency crises and George III's fragile health. This style of travel directly contrasted with George III's approach, whereby he brought with him a small, loyal court, and instead it was up to the more proactive members of the nobility to acquire their lodgings in the relevant neighbourhood if they hoped to achieve a chance informal encounter with their sovereign. So in conclusion, George III's preference for less spacious accommodation with as few courtiers as possible indicated a domestic approach to kingship, stemming from a more subdued lifestyle, a desire to spend time with his wife and children, and a wish for greater privacy when travelling. Rather than being a conscious strategic manoeuvre to promote his taste for domesticity, evidence of George's input when planning his visits indicate that the decision-making stemmed from personal inclinations and his logical approach to travel. This level of personal organisation indicated that George was basing his decisions upon medical advice and that of his friends with no local knowledge of the amenities. Due to the reasoning behind his need to travel, bringing his immediate family along with him, his preference for homely accommodation, and his refusal to maintain court routines when away, meant that George III projected an image of domesticity. As such, the press and public formed a notion of the king as a domestic figure who revelled in the ordinariness of engaging with local activities and communicating with the local inhabitants. In contrast, George IV's style of kingship was formed in opposition to his father's domestic approach, and hence took on a grandiose quality, echoing the pageantry of the medieval period in which he was often inspired by. His father's longevity meant that George IV had a prolonged incumbency as Prince of Wales, and hence he perpetually maintained the mindset of a libertine heir, never holding responsibility for being a moral figurehead for the nation, and instead having the freedom to enjoy his own whims and expenses. Regardless of the detrimental impact that his private life had on his popularity, through utilising travel, George IV was able to craft a different public persona for himself. With the freedom to build up an aristocratic network of friends and leisure time to indulge more frequently in visits around Britain, George IV was able to project an image of kingship, of pleasure and decadence. Regardless of how the two monarchs perceived themselves and their role, how this was conveyed to those close to them and the wider public was a different matter. The writings of courtiers living with and travelling alongside the royal family demonstrate a multitude of different opinions of kingship, ranging from criticism of too much simplicity to concern about not enough pageantry to requests for royal favours. Whatever their opinions, however, very few courtiers seem to have been able to exert any influence over the monarchs regarding their travel arrangements, and both George III and George IV continued to plan their royal visits around their own preferences and convenience. Thank you.
Thank you. I know Paige is happy to take a few questions if there is anyone who has any today.
Oh, hello. Very interesting. It's lovely. I was just wondering what made you choose either those two kings for that period of time.
That's a really good question. I think it's something I've always been, in that period has always been interesting. So, and it sort of stemmed from my academic research all the way throughout. So for my undergrad, I looked at queenship in the late 18th century. So I looked at Queen Charlotte, Queen Caroline, George IV's wife, and Queen Adelaide, so William IV's wife, and compared how they were sort of projecting themselves as queenship and their private and public personas. And then from there, I moved on to royal funerals. So I compared sort of, there's a lot of royal funerals in the very early 19th century. All the Georgians and their wives sort of die within about 20 years of each other, and about the ceremony and pageantry that goes behind those. And they're quite, not as planned as you might think they are. There's a lot of sort of last minute changes and lots of mishaps and things that go off there. So sort of royal visits was sort of a springboard from there. Originally, I wanted to sort of go a bit further, include William IV and Adelaide as well, but sort of construction of word count and research, you sort of have to hone it in a little bit. But I always found these two play off each other quite nicely, that it's quite nice to compare them with their sources.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. Fascinating talk. Of course, royal visits weren't new. Going right back to Tudor times,
Yeah.
and probably before
Yeah.
then. Henry VII used to land up on Baron's castles and places with his whole vast entourage, and they jolly well had to accept he would be there, and if he did, he would go there, and if he didn't go there, deadly insult, and they were practically bankrupted when this vast entourage turned up and would stay several days or weeks there, and of course the king got his way, you know.
Yeah, I think that's why, particularly this period, there's been such a long gap. So I sort of touched on it at the start. So George I and II don't do any royal visits around Britain. So by the time George III gets to the throne, and he's a bit slow starting, so it's not really to the 1780s, but you've had half a century or more without royal visits happening. The public haven't seen the face of their monarch very much, so it's a chance to re-establish how that protocol is happening, and I think George III takes his own approach with it, but George IV is definitely sort of echoing that more medieval style of going to Torham and looking at it, and the rest of the thesis does look at sort of a few individuals who have bestowed a visit and they're planning with 3 weeks or less notice and they're racking up tens of thousands of pounds debt, they're redecorating the house, they're calling in favours and bringing the cockery from other people, so, and servants, there's just not enough to go around, so it's quite... the sources that survive for those are very hit and miss. So you find a really nice example, and then it's quite hard to do a comparative across everywhere they stayed. But yeah, the late George IV is definitely echoing that more medieval style.
Just as a follow-up, one question I had whilst listening to you was the frugality and the privacy that George III enjoyed. Did that cause any offence to those who expected him to stay more than a day? Did they see it as a social, cut in their status, or were they just delighted to have him, and perhaps not the great expense as well?
I think probably the latter. I think even though he's not staying with their houses, he's still in the vicinity, so people are still seeing him. He's out and about, and he's all going to the theatre, so they are still getting to mingle with the king. They're just not having to put up with him and the expense of it. So there's still a bit of, he doesn't escape court routines entirely, but he's definitely trying to shed off as much as he can. I mean, he's still writing notes to the government while he's down in Weymouth. He calls the Privy Council down to the seaside at one point to sort out a crisis rather than go back to Windsor. So yeah, you sort of get that blend, and it's quite hard to disentangle. I think George is trying his hardest to go, I'm on holiday almost, let's not blur it if I can.
Oh, very good. Sheila, I think you had a question then.
Yeah, I was just wondering that you talked in one instance about the salmon and the lamprey and all of that, but you didn't talk, all those visits, presumably there was a lot of eating going on. And are there records of that? Do you know, were the local families cooks providing local food, or was the monarchs bringing their own people with them?
A bit of both. It's not. I think the problem is it's never a set thing. They're all doing bits. So George III does bring some of his own servants down. I think particularly when he goes to Portsmouth, more of a naval review than a sort of a holiday visit. He's bringing some of his servants, but they're also requesting. There's a note saying you need to go to the local town and get as many wine glasses as possible because we're not bringing them from the court. As for local families, there's definitely some menus that exist. They're trying to feed off the land, but there's also lots where they're importing food. They're borrowing servants from all the neighbouring households if they're having to put on a banquet. I know Liverpool has a visit where George IV stays, sort of as a civic visit, and there's in the town memoranda or the minutes, the two cooks have a fight and they sack one of the cooks, so then someone is sent down to London to go and find a new cook, and while you're there, can you go to Rundle's and Bridges and Rundle's and get a gold box, and can you get all these ingredients? And I think the thing that always surprises me is how quick a notice they're having to do this. These aren't planned months and months in advance. It's 3 weeks or less normally, so it is often more of a scrabbling around, and you're trying to make the best of the situation you've got than all the time you would have liked to have planned for a royal visit.
Oh, amazing. Yes.
I was going to ask the same question, but what it sort of led me to want to wonder whether they actually had court cookbooks that they noted that recipes in that the monarchs liked and sort of kept those as...
I've not found it. There's definitely one example I know for George IV that he has quite a few of his menu books, and I think for the state visits in Ireland and Edinburgh and potentially Hanover as well, that does have the menus, and it has all the food for servants as well, who's dining in sort of the main room and then who's getting fed elsewhere.
Would they record the recipe?
Not necessarily the recipes, more just what's on the table. I found sort of what's being served on an evening, then how they made it.
Can I just ask, what happened when George IV was regent, and his father was obviously too ill to actually do the job of being king? Were there royal visits then?
Yeah, so he is particularly, that's sort of a period he sort of particularly takes up. So from sort of the 1790s, 1800s, and then the 18 teens, George IV's doing almost annual those progresses, particularly into the Midlands, North and Yorkshire, around those time. And he has a big visit in 1814 with the Allied sovereigns come over. So he's effectively acting as monarch at that point. So
And after, obviously, it was the period of wartime
yeah,
and the deprivation
yeah,
because of the war. I mean, he was obviously incredibly unpopular.
yeah.
So how did you get on with all that then? Did you just
I think with him, what George IV's quite interesting is, and I think the contrast, so George III is trying to be private, but in the way he's doing it, he's quite public about his privacy. He's mingling with the people, so people see him, the newspapers report it, so his privacy becomes public. George IV does the opposite. He has this quite public, exuberant persona, but when he travels, he stays private. So when he's staying in these country houses, he's not being seen by the public. The newspaper articles are really scant, trying to trace his steps. It's very just a quick, he's going to be in Oxford this week, then he's going to Yorkshire. Whereas George III, his is very much, he was seen mingling and the princess was wearing this dress and he had a conversation with this and then he was in church. George IV is a lot harder.
His wife was like, and his daughter, they were like sort of public heroines. Everyone loved them and they hated him.
Yeah.
I thought it was probably quite difficult for him to
I think there's always still a thing of seeing royalty is always quite an excited. So even those who don't necessarily approve of the monarchy or dislike it still turn out to see them because they want to see that once in a lifetime event. But yeah, his popularity sort of suffered, and I think he's not really one for public duties. He sort of does the bare minimum where he has to. He sort of turns up, waves, has a quick dinner or a quick speech and goes back again. So yeah, he's sort of curbing how much he's out. But he travels a lot more. It's just not as publicly known as his father.
That's an interesting contrast, actually, sort of the public versus private and the persona. Yes, you have another question.
Yeah, just as an aside, talking about royal menus, the menus at Buckingham Palace for the state visits would always be checked by Queen Elizabeth, who had a faultless knowledge of French. Menus would all be in French. Just before when all the tables were set up and the menus were out, Queen would always check the menus to see that the French was correct. I'm just wondering who will do that now. She took a great delight in that, you know.
Yes, the pomp and ceremony and the visits yet to come are something to look forward to, something new area of research.
I suppose
It's all to be seen. Someone in years to come will be researching what Charles III is doing.
Exactly.
Well, unless there's any further questions, I hope you can join me in thanking Paige. And best of luck that your doctorate comes through imminently. I'm sure it's more than deserved. And we look forward to seeing you perhaps in the future and what you go on to do. Thank you
for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.